Hey guys, and welcome back to Mudstuds and Skullcaps podcast. I'm Robin.
And I'm Kelsey, and in today's episode, we're going to start to unpack some of the research behind the bit versus bitless discussion. Is there really a superior choice? And is the Dr. Cook's Bridle really the best new invention since sliced bread? Don't forget to check out last week's episode where we discussed whether or not grooming your horse will lead to creating a stronger bond between you two, and what is oxytocin's role in creating this bond. And of course, don't forget to head over to Apple Podcast app, scroll to the bottom of our podcast page, and leave a review. These reviews help other listeners to find a new podcast to listen to. There are tons of podcasts out there, and finding a new and interesting one can be a bit of a challenge at times. These reviews allow the Apple Podcast app to better rank the available podcasts when you're in the search function of the app. Thanks for listening and enjoy the episode. So here we are.
How do you breach this wall?
It's actually interesting because I've seen a lot of people posting and talking about this topic in the last couple weeks. So it feels like here we are jumping in and deciding to add our voices to this discussion about bit versus bitless. Is one of these better than the other?
I think it's always been such a hot topic debate, and I feel like anyone, once they start trying to get their own voice out there, getting their own opinions out there, at some point, absolutely everyone underneath the sun has to address bit versus bitless, or if they don't do bit versus bitless, they do what kind of bits I use and why. At some point, it comes down to this discussion. No matter which one you use, acts on very sensitive parts of the horse's face. So no matter what's going on. Yeah, it's a big part because we all use bridles, right?
We all use bridles, and I absolutely think there's a certain level of perception when people see you using one bit or hack more or whatever it is you're using. There's a certain perception that goes with that.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's a reflection of the type of training and the type of program that we practice with our horse is our bit, tells the story of who we are and what we do with our horse. And I think that's why it's almost so personal to a lot of people, because it is a direct reflection of who you and your horse are. But it goes beyond that, because you're going to see, if you see someone who shows up in a bitless bridle, you automatically put them and their style of riding and their style of thinking in one box. And you see someone who shows up to a show or to, wherever, and a big curb bit and a shank, and you put them in another box. And you think that these two riders could not possibly have the same philosophies. Depending who you are, one of those riders is a good rider and the other is a bad rider. And we immediately look at the mouthpiece to draw that distinction.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to it. I hope with our discussion that we could kind of approach it from a different perspective and a different route, because I feel like the typical route people take with it, and I guess the argument that I'm frustrated with the bit versus bitless, because it feels very roundabout and you never really get anywhere, is that it seems like people are always presenting as, well, bits are abuse, the horse's mouth is much too sensitive, but then everyone responds with, well, the horse's nose is sensitive as well, and nasal passages are right there. So in reality, bitless is just as, at play on the sensitive tissue of the horse as a bit is, and everyone always comes back with the argument that bit is just as harsh as the hands, as well as bitless is just as harsh as the hands. And you never really get anywhere past that argument, but there's so much more happening.
Right. So for our discussion today, and we want to do multi-parts on this topic, because there's just so many pieces to this debate and so many pieces to this conversation. But for today's discussion, we are going to be removing the pain piece from this discussion. We are not going to address whether one of these is more painful or causes more damage than the other. We're going to just table that part of the discussion for another day, because, any piece of equipment, you have to remember any piece of equipment, whether it's the halter, whether it is, even the horse. The horse is only as good as the person riding it. So that excuse and that statement is, table it. The good hands, bad hands.
Well, it's so subjective.
Right. It doesn't, we want to remove that subjectiveness and that personalness from it, but we also want to remove this pain discussion, because there's a lot to that discussion of, whether a bit is invasive because it's inside the horse versus, bitless, which is outside the horse. There's so much to that topic. We're just not going to go there today. We're going to kind of take a different look.
Yeah. And there's so much more to the discussion than just that. And I feel like the pain stuff, while very important, it's just barely skimming the top, like barely skimming the surface. It feels so superficial when that's all people talk about, because like you have to look at the horse as a whole. There's so much happening to their entire body.
Right. And I think the problem with the pain discussion is also it's often very off-putting to people, because for the longest time, I said no to the Bitless conversation. I didn't want to be part of that community, because those who were part of it came so they were so abrasive with how they approached it. And, just, matter of fact, you're abusing your horse because you have a bit. And it's like, well, I'm not abusing my horse. I have kind hands. I would never. And when you kind of tell people that they're either an abuser because they use a bit or they're not because they don't use a bit, it's just an off-putting way to start that conversation. And it's really not what made me want to seek out more information about Bitless. It was actually what you're going to talk about, is that breathing versus chewing, that I was like, oh, that is interesting to me, and that is something that's really making me pause and question.
I guess we'll talk about it later, but I think like the biggest part with that is that you can soften your hands no matter which method you're using. You can soften your hands with a bit, and you can soften your hand bitless. That way the pain element is as minimal as possible. But, when you look at different training methods, different strokes for different folks, like different things work for different horses. Different training methods don't work for all. But when you look at how the horses, their body physically responds to something, that doesn't change on horse. Like their cardiorespiratory system doesn't change on the horse's training preference. That's consistent throughout.
Okay, so let's define these things real quickly, because I do think there is some definition issues going around. What is a bitless bridle? What is a hackmore? Are these the same thing? Blah, blah, blah. So for our discussion, and for most discussions, a bitless bridle is actually a trademark term. Dr. Cook has actually trademarked the term bitless bridle. And so most bitless bridles are going to be that cross-under design, right? They're designed to never have a bit on them, to operate and to function. The proper term is govern. You govern your horse with the bridle. The bitless bridle is not just a headstall without a bit. It is a specially designed piece of equipment that could not have a bit attached, and that is typically going to be that cross under. Dr. Cook. Dr. Hook.
Captain Hook is here.
Captain Hook, yes. His bridle, like I said, he trademarked the bitless bridle. That is like his thing. The other option or other alternative is a hackmore, which a hackmore is more of a broad term. There's tons of different hackmores. There's bezels, side pulls, the wheel, the flower, the mechanical, the English, the German. The list goes on, right? There's 100 different types of hackmores, and those are more of a bit substitute, but at the end of the day, they're really just a fancy noseband. So they rely mostly on nose pressure and chin pressure to get the horse to go where you want it to govern the horse, where the bitless bridle, specifically Dr. Cook's, relies on cheek pressure and then pull pressure to get the horse to go where you want. These others do include cheek pressure and pull pressure, but their main function on the hackmore is it's just a fancy noseband.
Interesting. I never looked at it that way.
I mean, that's what it is. It's just a noseband. Sorry, guys. So I did find a 2015 article that was written by Dr. Cook titled "Man Bites Horse, Bit Rule Examined," because I do think it is important when we are talking about bitless bridles to remind everyone that there's very few organizations that do allow bitless bridles. I believe Western Dressage and something else Western allows for bitless bridles, typically a Bosel, to be used in competition. And the reason for this is that most organizations don't believe you will have control of your horse if you show up in a bitless bridle. And I find this very frustrating.
Off-putting? Such a incorrect take on why we have bits.
And it's so frustrating because, like, what are you... So you just imagine because I choose to use a bitless bridle, I didn't do any training with my horse, and I'm like just crossing my fingers. We stop at the end of like our ride. Is that really like that's your thought of me as a rider, that I couldn't possibly have prepared for this and couldn't have possibly checked that I had brakes? So I find that like really frustrating that is sort of the response that's given. But I also find Dr. Cook sometimes a little bit frustrating because I am going to talk about his design, and While we have complained a lot about manufacturers never doing research or releasing it to the public, Dr. Cook is the opposite of that. He's done a lot of research and he's released it all to the public. He is everywhere. And yet here I am in this episode, I'm going to avoid his research, and even though we're talking about his product. And I wanted to do that for a very specific reason, because he approaches everything from the aspect of pain. This article is a really interesting article, but it lists 16 different reasons not to use a bit, and they all talk about emotional and physical pain to the horse and to the rider. That's great, but we have to start moving in this conversation beyond just pain. And we have to start understanding that there's a lot more going on. And so for that reason, I have specifically chosen not to talk about Dr. Cook's research, but I will in future episodes come back to it and talk about it.
But wasn't it almost impossible to find resources out there that weren't based off of his previous studies and papers? I was having such a hard time finding anything that didn't heavily reference and rely off of his previous discoveries, which there's nothing wrong with that, but at the same time it would have been interesting to see people referencing a different take.
So the really frustrating thing about this is that there's not a single study that looked at hackmores or riding in a halter or riding in a Boselle. There's not a single study that looked at that.
No.
Every single study is just looking at his equipment. And I have nothing, that's fantastic, because we complain constantly about manufacturers not providing any information. But I also find it really frustrating that the research is Bit or Dr. Cook. You either are in a Bit or you're in Dr. Cook. And it's I don't want to ride in a Dr. Cook bridle. What if I want to ride in a side pull? Or what if I want to ride in a different setup? Why are those our only options? Because his bridle does not operate. His bridle operates in a very specific way that not most bridles don't operate in. Does that mean anything?
I was getting frustrated with it because I appreciate all the research that he's done, but sometimes his language comes off very biased, and he's clearly coming from one side of the argument, calling out the bits as abuse. And sometimes it's blatantly right there from the beginning of the studies. And while you read through it, the results most of the time are warranted and totally fine. It comes with a lot of biased language in between, where a contrasting study was one that was done in conjunction with Fairfax Saddles looking at nose bands, and they were a lot open-minded and friendlier with how they're approaching the other nose bands versus their nose bands. So it changes your mindset on how you're reading through the literature.
Yeah, and it's really challenging because of the language he uses. I mean, then I can't think of any off the top of my head, but the titles of his research studies are a little obvious where this is going to go. And if that's where you're starting, you're going to only be looking for information that confirms your belief. And so that's why, as much as I appreciate a manufacturer doing their research and providing it to the public, it is a little off-putting to see such strong language in the titles of the studies. So since we've been talking about Dr. Cook, I definitely went and looked up his patent. So his patent was filed in 2001, and looking at his website, it does look like he started on the market or really selling his products in 2000. That's where his copyright date is.
Okay.
And you guys will be surprised by this design. There's some differences from what he got patent to what you can actually buy on the market. I do not think his patent design ever made it to market. I couldn't find any evidence of it.
Really?
Oh, really?
Oh, hi.
I don't think this ever went to market, and I bet them. And you're gonna. It does. It's absolutely the right patent. It's absolutely registered to his name. I have the right patent. It's very obvious. It's the exact design. There's just some differences. Okay.
All right, let's hear it.
Yeah, I'm going to read the abstract for you. A bitless bridle for humanely, physiologically, and effectively restraining and controlling a horse or other animal at rest. I love the other animal, and I'm just picturing, what is that other animal? Is it a camel? Is this an elephant? Cow? What are we putting this on? I'm really curious. Okay, so anyway, controlling a horse or other animal at rest and at exercise comprises an elongated strap that includes a centerpiece at the pole and two crossover straps at the sides, attachable to a pair of reins, providing a direct link between the centerpiece and the reins. The crossover feature of this bitless bridle provides for persuasive but non-painful pressure to be applied to the whole of the opposite side of the head of the horse from pole to chin for rapid alternate pressure to be applied to both sides of the head. So from pole to chin, or for rapid alternate pressure to be applied to both sides of the head.
Rapid alternate pressure?
Yeah. That sounds like seesawing. I don't know why he included seesawing in his patent. What are you... That's rapid alternate pressure is seesawing. And that's also, please don't do that. And also really confusing because you're pushing the horse, not pulling the horse with his bridle design. And I'm just like, I don't know. That feels really uncomfortable and really unnecessary. So if you think that was weird, wait for it. It's about to get way weird.
No.
The centerpiece, which is the crown piece, may include a plurality of holes for receiving studs for applying painless pressure on regions of special acuity at the pole and behind each ear of the animal, or may receive a separate sleeve which includes the studs in order to apply pressure over areas of special acuity. Studs of different sizes can be fitted in a range of locations depending on the amount of pressure required and the conformation of any particular horse or animal. Yes, the crown piece was designed with tons of holes, and the drawings, I get that these are like hand drawings, but he's got a real lumpy horse head because he's got screws in the bridle, and these are not like, I could see justification for if it was like a quarter, like imagine a side, like a quarter, a disc, like a metal disc or a quarter that's like flat like a quarter, and that was screwed in, and so you were when you put pressure on the rein, it would apply it to like right surface area. But these are like studs, like little screws that would be in behind the horse's ears and but next to their pole.
You can't see my look of horror, but I have a look of horror. After everything I was learning this past week, looking into the differences in our crown pieces on our bridles and the force they exert on our horses' heads, the idea to increase the amount of pressure you are putting on their pressure points. Has anyone ever had pressure applied to a pressure point? I have. I have pressure point training. It is not comfortable. Like, that's how are you going to claim that's pain-free? To apply pressure?
I don't know.
Oh.
Yeah. And, like, I'm not making this up. You can see from the design that, like, this is what he intended, which is crazy to me. And I imagine the only reason it didn't make it to market was because someone was like, hey, if you want this to be, you know, a kinder option, you gotta get rid of the metal pieces. No screws, no nails in the horse's head. It's just not a good look. There's also one other design feature that you only could tell from the pictures. It's not as bad as the studs. It's just it was designed to be used with a bit. It's not the wrong patent, guys. I have the correct patent. It's his name. It's the bridle. It's not the wrong patent, but the original, because how it's designed currently is that the cheek piece is a solid piece into the noseband, and it used to, the original patent design, it was so you could unclip it, and it was like a buckle with a little strap, so you could either ride with or without a bit. And I don't know if this was like maybe for a transitional period to like get the horse to move off the bit onto the bitless. I don't know. But like, you could. It says snaffle. The image is labeled with the word snaffle. So I don't think I'm wrong on this one, but it was designed to be used with a bit. Or like a bit optional, hand pet option.
How like contrasting to all the stances and wording he has used in how many research papers out there?
Right, at least 15. I don't know. And back to the whole stud piece, I think it's important to note that this design of the Dr. Cook's bridle does rely heavily on pole pressure due to how the straps are designed, that when you apply pressure, yes, the pressure does first go on the horse's cheek, and then the second place it goes is the strap moves on the pole and applies pressure to the pole. So those studs were very strategically placed to apply pressure behind the horse's ears next to the pole on specific locations. No, I cannot find anywhere where he actually sold that bridle design, but I have seen some complaints from people whose horses do not like the pole pressure because the pole straps, they're like underneath the crown piece instead of being on top of the crown piece, where some other bridles have the straps on top of the crown piece. The other thing that I was really worried about, and the reason I've never looked seriously into purchasing these, is I thought it might be confusing for horses to go between maybe a more traditional like snaffle and more traditional pressure. Because going between a bit and like a halter and a hackmore is actually a pretty simple transition. Yes, there's some things you need to retrain, but I was kind of worried that maybe there'd be some struggles, and that doesn't seem to be the case. A lot of horses seem to be able to make this conversion really quickly to the Dr. Cook bridle. So that's good, but there is a version, it's not Dr. Cook's version, it's someone else's, where it crosses under once and then crosses again. And I don't know how you steer on that, because
weird.
It would be the opposite, where like Dr. Cook's, if you pull on the right, it puts pressure on the left, and that pushes the horse to the right. So your horse is still following your right hand. Where this other one, where it crosses twice, you'd be pulling on the right, which would put pressure on the right, and your horse would go to the left. And I don't think I could do that. That sounds too weird.
So the thing that I keep thinking about that I haven't looked into this much in regards to bitless bridles and how they operate on the horse's face and such, but just thinking about a bunch of the studies I read this last week when I was looking into anatomical bridles versus standard bridles with bits on them and like how they were affecting our horses' faces and such. And one of the studies discussed that with the increased pull pressure, as well as like increased pressure on their nose, it actually shortens the horse's forelimb extension and reduces flexibility in their limbs, because it like impacts these really sensitive myofascial lines in the horse's face that run throughout their entire body and are linked into their hooves. And so it's really interesting looking at that, as well as some of the information about the nerves where they're located in the horse's face, that anatomical bridles go out of their way to avoid like the TMJ and the trigeminal nerve that are up near the ear and like closer to the eye. But it's curious with these bitless bridles how not many really seem to take into play where these sensitive tissues and nerves are on the horse's face. And so like it really makes me question that, because a lot of times that even the pressure that our standard bridles are putting on our horse's face is it's enough that we have looked at other animals and said, hey, this much pressure on nerves causes nerve damage, yet we exude this much pressure in our bridles on our horses' faces.
Yeah, that's definitely something I am curious about and want to explore more. But
no one's looking at that. I haven't found anything that actually looks at that. Most the studies out there.
Not for bitless.
It's all like pain. And then when I was looking at the breathing stuff, they had different things they were looking at with the breathing, but none of it really addresses. They look at the bit and say, how is the bit bad? No one ever looks at the bitless and says, how is the bitless working? And is this truly the best option that we have out there for them?
Right, and I don't disagree with that at all. And that's kind of the frustration with, like, I want to ride in a hackmore, and I want to know what is the best hackmore to ride in. But there's no, like, I have to buy them all and practice first to try to figure out which one's going to put the less pressure or who likes. And that I find really frustrating, because I don't want to ride in a Dr. Cook's bridle. I have nothing against it. I might buy one in the future. But I'm choosing actively. It's not like, but my point being, I want to know about other pieces of equipment, not just this bridle. And there's a range of other pieces of equipment. And I don't know if the reason we look at Dr. Cook so much is because he's done so much research on his own that other studies are trying to prove him right or wrong. And again, there's not a lot of other studies. I found two that weren't done by him, but we're looking at his bridle, trying to confirm his.
So what I was looking at with this first part of our bit versus bitless debate was looking at the claims, allegations about bits impeding the horse's airflow. And there kind of is two arguments or two places where most of what I was reading was saying how bits interfere with the horse's breathing. The first one is that they say rein tension results in the closure of the horse's throat. So as they increase the degree of their head carriage, they close their throat, making it harder for them to breathe. It's, stick your chin on your chest right now. It's a little harder to breathe and swallow and do those kind of motions. The other part of the argument is that bits do not allow the horse to seal their lips. And we've mentioned this previously. But this not allowing them to seal their lips causes numerous issues ranging from incorrect soft palate development, breathlessness of varying degrees, and other tissues impeding the horse's airway due to the loss of the vacuum seal that sealing their lips provides. So kind of like the first order of business, I wanted to address the big thing, which was the ability of a horse to seal their lips and how their cardiorespiratory system functions. So the horse's cardiorespiratory system functions at max capacity or at its peak performance when the horse is able to seal their lips. So when the horse is sealing their lips, what happens inside their mouth and in their respiratory system, when the lips seal, it enables the larynx to fit tightly into the buttonhole known as the ostium intrapharyngeum of the soft palate. So when they seal their lips, the larynx is able to fit tightly into this buttonhole that is created. This holds the soft palate against the root of that seal, ensuring that air cannot enter the oropharynx. And that's what connects the soft palate to the hyoid. So all of this then allows the tongue to widen the nasopharyngeal airway, which then opens up the horse's airway to allow as much air as possible to go through their cardiorespiratory system. This, like their cardiorespiratory system, the way it functions when their lips are sealed is what makes horses such incredible athletes. But when this seal is broken, the soft palate ends up rising and vibrates with each breath, impeding the nasopharyngeal airflow. So one of the studies I was reading, they kind of summed up what happens when this seal is broken with the lips or when the horse has their mouth open when they're trying to breathe. And it says that the loss of the oral vacuum has creates a dynamic collapse of the nasopharynx, which is the soft palate, instability and dorsal displacement. It has an obstruction of the choanae, don't know how to say it. I looked up what it was. I didn't understand. And then gaping of the pharyngeal orifice to the guttural pouch. It has the dynamic collapse of the larynx and dynamic collapse of the dorsal membrane of the trachea, which over time, permanent distortion of the trachea cartilage can occur. Did that make sense, or do I need to redo that?
Pictures would help, really, honestly. Okay, I'm going to try to break this down, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. What you're trying to say is that when that seal is broken, it can cause damage to the horse's soft palate and to the systems, basically the little doors that provide a blockage between the air to go so that the air goes to the correct tube, which is the trachea, right? Trachea is correct. Is that what you're trying to say? Like the soft palate is basically the back of the horse's throat, and it's the thing that vibrates when you snore. So when you're snoring, your soft palate is vibrating. My horse Dublin, who is an ex-race horse, has his soft palate is paralyzed, which is somewhat common in the horsing world, and according to Dr. Cook, is caused by horses riding in bits and not being able to seal their mouth while they're racing. And that damage to that soft palate makes breathing more difficult for the horse in very simple terms. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's correct. That's fine. That's it essentially, is that close your mouth, suck in your tongue, and you feel how there's kind of a vacuum seal in your mouth. Obviously, we don't really breathe the same way horses do, but when the horse is breathing and their system is at max capacity, so they're in heavy work, they have to have that vacuum seal that allows air to go through the correct passage. And when they're able to seal their mouth, they're able to actually widen that passage to allow more airflow, which allows them to perform at a higher level. However, when their mouth is open, they lose this vacuum, which means these various pieces of like the tracheal cartilage and the soft palate collapses because it doesn't have that vacuum seal holding them all into place. And so when that collapses, you have all these kind of loose flaps vibrating and moving that actually interfere, reduce the amount of air the horse is taking in.
Okay, that explanation made a lot of sense. I got it. I got you. I think we're
great. Third time's a charm. You guys have no idea how many times I read this in different language. And here's the thing, actually, okay? When I was looking at this, I could not find a really good definition that broke it down in dumb people terms for me about why the horse seals their lips. It all just kept bringing me back to the exact same very confusing paragraph that is like mentioned in numerous different studies. So I was very frustrated with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's because this isn't even a concept that I think most people, I wasn't aware of this until recently. And yet, like I had no idea. I have a thoroughbred who has damage to his soft palate. I vaguely understood what was going on, but like I think part of the problem, and I think Dr. Cook's study tried to prove, and I can't remember the name of it. I mentioned it previously, but basically he did this whole study about why the bit is the issue when it comes to racing horses, and it's not the thoroughbred or a genetic disease that is occurring with these horses, that it's because they can't seal their mouth and operate at capacity that they're damaging their soft palate, and you're seeing so many thoroughbreds come off the track with these issues.
And another thing that I think we forget about, because I know I forget about, is that horses are not meant to breathe through their mouths. In fact, they rarely do. Oral breathing can occur, but usually only when anatomical abnormalities or disruptive conditions such as like dorsal displacement or displacement of the soft palate occur. breathing through the mouth for the horse is not normal.
Yes. Yeah. So Dublin can breathe through his mouth.
And he's not normal.
He's not normal by any means, but he's actually does not do it as much anymore. He was really bad when we first got him home in the first few years after he came off the track, but he's gotten a lot better, and he doesn't default to breathing through his mouth when he gets stressed. He continues to breathe through his nose. But yeah, it's not, they're supposed to breathe through their nose, so sealing their mouth is beneficial because it allows them, as you were saying, to broaden that airway. And when we're talking high capacity is barrel racing, it's horse racing, it's cross country,
dressage.
Yeah, all of these sports. It's not just a horse galloping, flat out away from a lion. It is the activities that we do on a day-to-day basis. That ability to seal their mouth is being lost, and there are potential impacts of that.
Yeah, and I actually looked a little bit further into what happens when the horse, beyond just like the physical, what the tissue that's flapping around loose and willy-nilly when the horse's mouth isn't sealed. I looked further into that to see what was occurring beyond that in their bodies when they could not seal their lips. And one of the things that I've read about in the Equine Welfare During Exercise, an evaluation of breathing, breathlessness, and bridles, published in May 2017, looks at this concept of breathlessness that happens in horses when they're unable to seal their lips properly, and we're expecting them to perform at high levels of intense exercise. And so there's essentially 3 forms of breathlessness. There is unpleasant respiratory effect, air hunger, and chest tightness. So air hunger is essentially a sensation of not being able to breathe insufficient air. It typically results in more air coming in with deep, rapid labor breathing, or it's like an abnormal deep, rapid breathing that happens. Chest tightness arises when there is a mismatch between the heightened ventilatory drive and the adequacy of the respiratory response. And so this breathlessness idea is your horse is short of breath and they just can't breathe correctly, which I think I've seen this happen with my own horse on cross country when I think about it. I've seen this happen where my horse is short of breath and just can't get enough air in. And I never put the 2 and 2 together. I always thought it was a lack of endurance or a lack of conditioning on my behalf, when a big part of it was the fact the Brit was interfering with this. And like, think of an asthma attack. Think about how helpless you feel with an asthma attack. I haven't had one, but I know you used to have asthma. I can't imagine your horse is feeling that shortness of breath. They can't get enough air in. They are sitting there sucking in air as much as they can, but because they can't fully seal their lips, they're not getting the same effects of us when we're trying to suck in air. So I can't imagine the panic and helplessness they feel.
To add to this, so when I have asthma attacks, and I still have them occasionally, they're exercise induced now, it basically feels like there's a cloth over your face, like there's something blocking you from being able to inhale completely. But when you talk about this idea, think about the bits. A lot of us have made that transition from a very thin KK, which is what a lot of us had been using previously. Now it's that much thicker nape bit. The size of your bit, even though that bit is a kind bit, the size of your bit can have a huge impact on your horse. The rubber bits are way thicker, yet they're, much gentler. But what does that actually translate to? Did any of them look at that? Because I'd be curious, because, we talk about, the problem with 3-piece bits is that they just sit on the tongue and the horse can't put their tongue up. But does it mullen mouth or a straight bar? Is that better?
I couldn't find anyone that actually looked at different bits and how it was affecting this. The vast majority of these studies that I was reading, which I was getting very frustrated with, were just looking at bits and how the horse's system works, and was like, hey, the bits aren't allowing their system to do what it's designed to do.
Were they just using snaffles, just a jointed snaffle?
The vast majority actually weren't studies. They were research papers that just talked about previously and referenced Dr. Cook's work previously. And when I read through his stuff, I got hung up in a lot of his very controversial language that it just took away from whatever he was saying. It minimized whatever he was doing because it was just so blatantly shoving his opinion down my throat. And I was like, well, okay, hang on one second here. But the other thing that I had an issue with, and I'm not disagreeing with this at all, I think is very real and very much so happens. However, the second breathing interference that they look at, they often claim with bits, is that rein tension. When the tension increases and the horse increases their head carriage and closes their throat, they're closing off their airway. And they tend to blame this on bits. But that's not limited to bits. That's all around. This occurs when the horse is closing their throat out in the pasture all on their own. This occurs in a bitless bridle as well as like a halter and a bit. So this isn't...
Yeah, anyone can ride behind vertical.
Yeah, and so they were also strictly looking at a horse. It looked like all the image they were showing was a horse that was closing their throat incorrectly. So if it showed, like they just showed the head and throat latch area, but if they showed the rest of the horse's body, I can almost guarantee it was not a pretty picture. They were definitely hollow and dropped out.
Well, we've talked before in the past mentioning that your horse should still have that U shape versus that V shape in the throat, and that V versus U probably has some impact on the horse's ability to breathe, but duplicating and having your horse hooked up to machinery, because that's what I found in that swallowing with the foam, can your horse swallow, was there was no way they were going to get a horse moving correctly and in a U shape and, you know, all this equipment in the horse's mouth to do this test. So I don't know how you would measure some of these things.
My final thoughts, I guess, on the whole breathing with bits versus bitless is that there clearly is a difference, that bits are interfering with the horse's natural system of how they seal their mouth. However, there is no direct comparisons of the cardiorespiratory dynamics and the extent of any respiratory pathophysiology in horses wearing bitted and bitless bridles. There haven't been anyone looking at the bitless and how they affect the horse's system. They only look at bits and are saying bits bad, bitless good, but this is why bits are bad. This is not why bitless is good.
Yeah, and that, because I think this is the concept that we're talking about, the horse's ability to breathe, is just like, it's one of those, like, it's so much fact that I feel like a lot of the research is like, well, here are the facts and here's how you could interpret it when you add a bit to the facts, instead of actually spending a lot of time doing that research to figure out what is the impact. Because I'd be curious, you know, we talk about the 3-piece bit, something with, you know, a double jointed, that the design of that is to sit kind of heavy and on the horse's tongue, and that a lot of us switched from the single jointed bit to that. But does a single jointed bit actually stay off of the tongue, and is breathing better in that single jointed bit than it would be in a double jointed? Obviously, there's still impacts because facts, you know, there's no research looking at what is the best option. If you have to ride in a bit, is it ported? Is it straight bar? Is it single jointed, or is it double jointed? Dr. Cook, it's really just the language. I really appreciate the research, and I get that he's selling a product, but I also get that he's someone who's passionate and is willing to spend the time and the resources into looking at them. It's really just the language that, like, kind of puts that taste in my mouth. But that's also the same thing that made me avoid this debate for so long in the first place, because I was like, the language and how people approach this topic with people who are new to the subject and new to this idea, it can be really off-putting. And the research behind the horse's ability to seal their mouth was kind of like the first thing that was like, oh, this makes sense to me. This is something to look more into. For like that reason alone, I am comfortable taking a bit out of my horse's mouth and looking for an alternative, because that reason alone makes sense to me, regardless of the rest of the discussion.
Yeah, regardless of your horse's preferred training methods and how they want to be handled or what they prefer, their system is going to operate the same as a wild horse, as the horse next to them wearing bitless. Like, it's going to be the same. That is not subject to change. That is one constant variable.
The next piece of this was I wanted to look at what sort of research was there that kind of just looked at general impressions of a horse in a bit versus a bitless bridle. What were those exterior physiological signs that the horses were showing? Whether were they showing signs of conflict and discomfort in one of these or the other, and just sort of that general picture of bit versus bitless. So both of these studies both use Dr. Cook's bridle, and I think, again, these studies are trying to either prove or disprove his belief. or his research. So I think that's why they chose Dr. Cook, Bitless Bridle. But the first one is it's a 2009 study, and it was published in the Australian Journal of Veterinary Behavior. And this is a peer-reviewed journal. So this was peer-reviewed by at least one other scientist. I read their rules for getting in this journal, how things work. And that only kind of matters because of the second study I'm going to reference. So this study is called Preliminary Investigations of Horses, parentheses, Equus Caballus, responses to different bridles during foundation training. So basically what they did is they started with 6 horses that were 2 years old and had only been previously handled on the ground and had not been saddled yet. And I don't know if these horses, I think they had been lunged maybe traditionally with like one lunge line and the person in the middle of the circle, because they do long lining, and it seemed, what I was trying to understand, that long lining was new to these horses. They started with 6 horses, 2 thoroughbreds, 2 warm bloods, and 2 Australian stock horses, which I would say are similar to a quarter horse in America, or like a Mustang, something that's a little bit more Western. So we're already starting with 6 horses, so you can see that there's going to be a statistical issue, which is something we talked about in a previous episode. The other issue with this study, and one of the big challenges, and we need to do a whole episode on research and the ethics behind these studies, because these were privately owned horses. So these were horses that were going to be handled by their owners, and one of the owners, for whatever reason, pulled one of their horses, and another horse was injured. So the study actually went forward with 4 horses in it. And that's a huge issue because one horse got injured, and this is actually really common, and one was, because they were privately owned, was easy to pull. Ownership in studies is a whole issue that we'll have to talk about at some point. Because of this really small group, because they ended up only having 4 horses, they did put a little note in the study saying the number of horses that completed this trial prevented any reliable statistical analysis. Therefore, only a descriptive analysis of the data is included. So this is one of the 2 studies, the only published in a journal study, and it ended up with 4 horses. So what they did is they broke the horses. They had 2 geldings and 2 fillies, and 2 went bitless for their first couple rides, and 2 went in a bit. The horses that were in a bit used just a full cheek snaffle, single joint full cheek snaffle, which is pretty common for young horses. And then the other horses that went bitless were in the Dr. Cook's cross-under bridle. So the research test experiment lasted for 11 days. The first 2 days were just introduction for the horses into the arena to make sure they were calm in the setting. Next 3 days were just bridling practice, and so this was videoed, and the behaviors during bridling was documented. So these horses were brought into the arena, and their chosen bridle, either the full cheek or the bitless, was put on them for 3 days in a row. Then the next 3 days involved long lining, so each horse spent 10 minutes being long lined in the arena, and then the last 3 days were the horses' first 3 rides. Again, each horse was ridden for 10 minutes. They all also had heart rate monitors that were hooked up on them to just simple heart rate monitors to monitor their heart rate during each work session. So the results of this study sort of varied. And again, it's 4 horses. It's a good horse, a bad horse, a horse with certain issues could really throw any results from this study. So the horses that were wearing the bitted bridle, they exhibited more chewing and opening of the mouth than those wearing the bitless bridle throughout all stages of training, and the frequency of those responses decreased as training progressed. Yeah, anyone who's ever put a horse in their horse's mouth, a bit in their horse's mouth for the first time. Okay, don't put horses in horses' mouths. Use bits, or don't use bits. Even if there's a horse in a horse's mouth, there's a certain amount of chewing and biting that's happening. But any time you've ever had a horse get their bit for the first time, there's lots of chewing and lots of playing, and that goes away as they get used to it. So that's not anything to me. That's not information. That's not helpful. The horse wearing the bitless bridle exhibited more head lowering during long reining than those wearing the bitted bridle. And the horses wearing the bitted bridle did more head shaking during the initial bridling and long reining than those wearing the bitless. But those wearing the bitless did more head shaking while riding. So it seemed that basically the general feeling from this experiment was those horses that were doing the long reining and the bitless seemed more relaxed, and their heart rate and their chewing and some of their other behaviors agreed with that. And then when they got to the riding, they seemed a little bit more anxious. Their average heart rate went up, and there was more head shaking, where the horses in the bit weren't doing that and were calmer. So it swapped. That makes sense, right? So
Okay.
they were good in one activity and not so good in the other activity. Really, because it was just such a small group, the only thing I'm really kind of interested in, they have a whole table with tons of behaviors and say how many times they did this per minute per activity. The only one that I think is really of any interest is the heart rate, because it's like the most sort of, a lot of these behaviors is hard because you're going to have horses that are tail swishers. You're going to have horses that are face rubbers. You know, my Hudson is constantly scratching and rubbing himself, and my other two horses just don't do that. That's just not their behaviors. So what does that mean at the end of the day? Like, he rubs his foreleg. That's Hudson's thing. It's not Nim's thing. I don't expect Nim to do that. So when you only have 4 horses, I don't know that behavior, because rubbing your leg or chewing on your body is typically seen as a sign of the horse is uncomfortable and they're trying to sort of avert their anxiety. It's hard when you only have 4 horses. So for the heart rate, average heart rate for bridling for both bitted and bitless was 33 beats per minute. For long reining for the bitted horses, it was 83 beats per minute and 59 bitless. And then that reversed for riding. So the average heart rate for those in a bit was 64, and the average in the bitless was 71. You know, they only rode the horses for 3 days, 10 minutes each ride. So that's an hour of information you're looking at. I would be so curious to know, continue this on. What are the horses' first 5 weeks like in bitless? How far do you get? How many activities can they go? What is their, do you feel like you're making more progress, less progress? There's a lot of unanswered information with this study. Their conclusion in this study was that, we need to do more, studies in this area, but they concluded that bitless did show better results than the horses in the bit. And I just don't know that the study shows that. I just don't.
Yeah, that's an interesting conclusion when you look at all the behaviors they were examining and stuff. It's such a small pool. That's what I keep coming back to.
But never fear, because I did find another study that had a bit bigger of a pool. So I found a second study.
What was their pool size?
12. They determined that 12 was adequate in order to do the statistical evaluation of the data. They determined they needed at least 12 horses in order to run some statistical equations to come up with an answer. This study, it's actually not a study. Well, it is a study. It's just not a peer-reviewed or published in a journal study. It is someone's thesis. It's her thesis paper for graduation. So the school publishes it, but it's not like actually in a journal or peer-reviewed. That doesn't mean it's a bad study. Reading through it, she put a lot of effort and a lot of work into it. So kudos to her. I hope she got a great grade on this, because it looks really well done, and there's a lot to it. And it's more than I can read. It's like 114 pages. So like,
oh, wow.
Good. Okay, claps to Rose Margaret Scofield. So great job, really appreciate the work. So this is called Comparison of Behavior Exhibited by Horses Ridden in Conventional Bitted and Bitless Bridles. And this was published in 2014. So basically what she wanted to do was this is like 2 parts to the study. The first part is that she wanted to identify what leisure riders were. So she did this whole survey thing where she got like hundreds of people to answer this survey to define what a leisure rider is.
Huh.
I get why, because she wanted to say that the horses they used were reflective of leisure riders. And actually, she references a study that I thought was really interesting, that it found that it has been suggested anecdotally that novice or new riders are the ones who are most likely to try out new pieces of equipment than those who are established or more knowledgeable.
Oh, I 100% believe that.
But I just thought that was interesting. So she wanted to find leisure riders because she thought leisure riders would be more likely to try using a bitless bridle than those who are more experienced and knowledgeable. So, like, I get it. The premise is, like, cool. It was just it was just a big chunk of the study I didn't need to read. You wasted a few of my minutes, Rose, is what I'm trying to say. A few of my minutes were wasted.
And now you're wasting everyone else's telling them about it.
And now look at you, Rose. You're making me waste everyone else's time. How could you, Rose? That's so rude of you. But also, I appreciate your work. Okay, so basically what she found was she took 10 horses that were from like a riding school and 2 that were owned by a private person. I don't know what the significance of those 2 that were owned by a private person is. She explained it, and there's some math behind it, but I'm going to say there was 12 horses, and they were all school horses. Okay, so they're used to being ridden. They were not privately owned. They did not have like a single rider who they were used to. They were used to being the school pony. And we all know school ponies. None of them had been used in bitless. They never had gone with that. Before, they were a mix of breeds and a mix of ages, but all were over 5. There was only 11 geldings and 1 mare. I think this is more reflective of the horses you're going to find in a school setting than you are like in the real world. As someone who has worked with horses that are for the public, they are mostly all geldings because housing mares and geldings is a pain in the butt. Each horse was ridden in 3 different dressage tests, and they chose like some of the simpler. The study was done in England, so they were the preliminary dressage tests, like the first 3. Actually, their dressage tests are numbered like 4, 12, and 28. I don't know what that means. So basically, they each rode 3 tests, and they rode in both the bitted bridle and the bitless bridle, and they did a coin flip to decide which bridle the horse went in first. They did try to camouflage the bridle so the rider couldn't tell. They had one rider who rode all the horses and did all 3 tests. So they did try to hide the bridles from her, but like as soon as she got on, she was like, I could tell this. You can't hide it from me. Because the reins are like connected and different. The reins, it's easy to tell. Basically, each horse was allowed 20 minutes to warm up in a bitless bridle prior to the coin flip occurring. And then when the coin flip occurred, they swapped bridles. Basically, their conclusion was that the horses did not like the bitless bridle. So their assessment of the data demonstrated that 6 different conflict behaviors occurred with both types of bridles. That was tail swishing, open mouth, cow, kick, hollow, fall out, and pull down. The frequency of each behavior was recorded along with the total number of behaviors exhibited, and that was behavior intensity. Whilst a similar amount of conflict behavior activity was observed in both bridle types, significantly more tail swishing was observed with the bitless bridle. And this led to their conclusion that the bitless was worse because the horses swished their tail more. And to me, I don't connect tail swishing and bit. To me, tail swishing is a sign that they don't like your leg.
Or that they're trying to figure something out. Like tail swish, I don't know if that, directly connects to like-dislike. Also, who was cow kicking? There's probably something else going on of like pain in his back.
So it looks like horse 5 was cow kicking. Horse 5 was also the one that did the most tail swishing. So to me, when I look at this, because she's got colored graphs and everything, that's really easy to look at and really nice.
Ooh, love pictures.
There are 2 horses that are tail swishers, and they swished their tail in both bridles. Yes, they did it more in the bitless, but I don't know. Did they go first in the bitless, and then they worked out their kinks, and then they went in the bit? Like, I get that they were doing the coin flip so that it was like totally by chance what bridle they were riding in, so that the behaviors wouldn't be affected, and they'd already done a 20-minute warm-up in the bitless. I don't know. What I did find really awesome, and I'm going to give them big props for doing, is they included the rider's notes. So she had comments about each horse 1 through 12, and what she thought about them when they were ridden in the bit, and what she thought about them when they were ridden in the bitless. And looking through this...
Oh, that's clever.
Yeah, I actually thought this was the most helpful because, so horse number 7, for example, he rushed into all the gates in the bitted bridle, but in the bitless was very responsive. To me, that says, oh, check for bitless. Like, that is a better choice for this horse.
Yeah.
For horse number 4, he was lighter in the mouth with the bit, and then he was hanging on the bridle on the left side in the bitless. Okay, then that tells me maybe there's a training issue, or maybe a bit's better for this horse. Same with so horse number 2 was better in the canter and more balanced with the bit, but in the bitless was more difficult to get in the corners and fussier in the mouth. I find that really interesting. Why was he fussier in the mouth when he was bitless? What does that mean? But there's horses that go back that are, horse number 12, strong in the canter, but more supple and bent easier in the bit, but he was more relaxed in the bitless. Other horses, better to canter, easier to manage, stride length less strong in the bitless. So to me, the conclusion isn't that one is better than the other. The conclusion is horses have preferences, and those, they have preferences. And then also, from my experience from trying to make the transition to bitless, there is some training that has to go in. You do have to spend some time retraining your horse to understand what these new cues are. That it's not going to happen.
Oh, there's definitely a learning curve.
Absolutely. And so are her notes reflective of a learning curve? Absolutely. I think horse number 5 was the horse that was cow kicking and tail swishing. To me, that horse may to have that maybe is a saddle issue. That maybe he's got pain in his back. That may have nothing to do with the bit. It could be an injury. It could be like 100 different things. And that's what's so hard with these studies, is that you don't know what that behavior actually means. Yes, you've changed a variable, but that he did it in both. He's probably, he's probably got something going on unrelated to the Bitless and unrelated to the headstall setup.
Well, so one of my issues that I've had when I look at some of these studies, that I don't think hers is necessarily superficial, but definitely some of the other ones that I have read where they only look at external body cues, they just feel very like they skim the top and don't go much deeper, when we've looked at previous studies and there's things going on inside the horse's body. There's stress hormones being released that is not necessarily apparent on the outside of their body, or a horse that's pinning their ears could be doing it for various reasons, just like a horse swishing their tail. It makes me wonder, what muscles were they contracting? Were they in pain? What was happening inside their body? Was there more stress hormones released when they were in the bit versus bitless? Like, I have a lot more questions.
Sure. Yeah. So you want, the things that don't change from horse to horse. It's not their personal preference is personal, but how much, cortisol or oxytocin you're releasing is not a personal, actually that is personal, but like it's going to occur in every single horse. And I get that. I just think it kind of comes back, the more I look into these studies, the more, the ethics behind them is something that we kind of have to question. And I say ethics not as in like, are these studies ethical, as in the rules behind how these studies occur. What is their funding? Who is funding what horses? Doing research on horses is so expensive. You've got to house them. You've got to feed them, right? You've got to have all this equipment to monitor them. And getting that funding is so challenging. And it's so frustrating that the manufacturers, Dr. Cook excluded, aren't willing to put any of that money into proving that their equipment works.
I would love to see Dr. Cook do some like pressure matting studies. It is frustrating because I understand that it costs so much money. So to get the stuff that can do pressure matting, to get the technology like the, the myography or something or other, that can look at the horse's muscles and see when they contract, is so expensive that I'm very grateful for Rose's study that looks at what she was able to identify and look at, which was their body language and their cues that they were signaling.
And that's the thing, is that it's really affordable for anyone to go out with a camera, because that's one of the other studies we talked about quite a few weeks ago, was that it was a bunch of students that went to a horse show and just videoed everything and then came back from that horse show. And so they just went and videoed the warm-up and videoed the rides, and then they, tallied up the behaviors that they saw and were able to kind of extrapolate the data from that. And they were able to say, look at this sample size. That's really easy to go because you can go to a horse show. But Bitless isn't allowed at most horse shows. So you can't even show up to extrapolate, to video a horse show and compare this data, because all you're going to get is horses and bits. You're not going to get anyone showing up without a bit unless you go to like Western Dressage or one of the few organizations where it's allowed. And so that's where, it's really frustrating, because you can't get easy access to some of this behavior to get enough information to make your study statistically relevant. So do you have any final conclusions? Should we, I don't know if it's clear our positions on bits versus bitless, if we've made that.
My position is confusion. I'm currently trying to figure out which pathway I want to go. Am I leaning more towards bit or bitless? And I think one of the questions I have to answer is, why am I using a bit? What is my goal? Because I'm not using it for control. My idea behind it is that it acts as another aid for my horse. So much in the same way you see someone doing liberty and they have a whip. They're not using the whip as a punishment. They're using it as a way to cue the horse and have an additional cue that they themselves cannot do with just their body. And so that's kind of how I look at my bit. So if that's my only thing that I'm doing it with the bit, can I accomplish that with bitless? And the only thing that's really swaying my opinion right now is the breathing, the interference that the bit has with breathing, especially if I'm asking my horse to go cross country or do something that's has a high amount of exercise and physical activity.
But it's illegal for you to go cross country without a bit.
Right, which is BS.
You can use a Hackmore and a bit and a flash, and you can put as much crud on your horse's face as you want.
Which is silly. That's absolutely ridiculous. And the fact that sorry, never mind. I won't go down that whole tirade. You just got me so worked up.
Well, what's frustrating is going back to Dr. Cook's article, The Man Bites Horse. He has like a whole thing. It's not actually Man Bites Horse. It's like a whole thing. Read the article. He explains the name of the article. No, it's not actually. Anyways, in there, his whole conclusion, despite, even though he talked mostly about pain, his conclusion wasn't that you need to ban bits. You just need to give people the option. And if people have the option, they'll phase out bits all on their own. And he can't wait till bits are in museums, which is great. Cool. We just want choice. And that's what I find so frustrating is that I don't know what's going to be best for my horse and what we're going to work best in. I know that Addie and Nim, they don't need a bit because I ride them at home and I think they have both shown me enough signs that they don't like bits. Nim's face gets rubbed raw from a bit, so we're done with bits. Addie, I can only ride her at a walk, so she doesn't need a bit, and I've never gotten her to be able to quiet her mouth. And so it's if she can't quiet, she can't relax her mouth and just be soft in a bit, then despite whatever bit I try on her, then we're going to try, a bitless route. I
think where I'm stuck at right now is that I'm leaning, I'm so torn and confused, but I think kind of where I'm stuck at right now that's stopping me from transitioning over to bitless is that don't necessarily agree with the pressure, the way bitless works on the horse's face, especially after everything that I was looking into this past week and the various networks and soft tissue and nerves that go on in the horse's face, that I don't necessarily agree with how the bitless operates on a horse's face. So I wish there was bitless options out there that are being specifically designed to avoid those peak pressure points, had stuff behind them backing them up, that they were better and reduced pressure that a standard bridle or a bit is providing on the horse's face, if that makes sense. And I just don't see those options out there on the market right now. So I'm going to stick with anatomical bridle and as gentle as a bit as I can go, but at the same time, just because you use a bridle that avoids their pressure points doesn't mean that fixes the breathing issue. I don't know. I'm confused. I
mean, there's just not enough options. I feel like because bitless is still so new and it's still, the majority of riders aren't wanting bitless. They want to ride in a bit, and that goes back to the organizations themselves. And if they will allow bitless, you'll see more people want to choose it and more options on the market. But because there's so few options right now, that there isn't really, the best thing hasn't been invented yet. The best new,
that's where I'm at.
I think that, and I get that, and it's a challenge because you want to balance all of these different things for your horse, but there's just no design out there that does that.
Well, maybe we need to design it. Maybe we need to figure it out and make it.
Well, I've been looking at trying to buy can I buy anatomical can I buy an atomic crown piece and can I make my own bridle? But are you saying that there's too much pressure, I have to be really careful with their nose, and that there's too many pressure points in their nose? Is that what you're saying? A Hackmore that is just a noseband isn't good either?
So I don't know, because no one has looked at bitless options like Hackmores and the bitless bridles. No one has looked at how their nosebands activate and work on the horse's face. So I don't know. Looking at traditional Cavasons and Fairfax, their study in particular that I did back in 2015 looked at crank nosebands, because that's a very common thing seen with double bridles and dressage, and those are known to exert a lot of pressure on the horse's face.
If you have to call it a crank, can we just throw out there that maybe it's not the best piece of equipment. It is called a crank.
But their intention was to design a crank Cavason that did not exert the pressure points across the horse's nose as a traditional one does, which I really like what they were doing, in that they prove that you could take a crank noseband that exerts a lot of pressure and is hindering your horse's movement and flexibility, and still have a crank noseband, but change the padding and where the pressure is being exerted and disperse it across the horse's face a lot more evenly, which then had the benefits on the horse. So I think that goes to show that we can totally have bitless options out there that while they're working on the horse's face, if we design them with the intention of avoiding these peak pressure points, then they will be avoiding those peak pressure points. That there is more humane options out there, if that makes sense. That's what I took away.
Yeah, there is a more humane option out there. It's just going to be required designing it. Because it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist yet. That's the thing, is I think the option that I would buy and the Bitless option I'm looking for isn't on the market yet. And so that's why I haven't necessarily transitioned over. Are we done? Are we good?
There is our 2 cents. Yeah, we added it to this discussion.
Was our part 1. I don't know when the second part is
coming
coming
1,
out.
yeah. Oh, yeah, it probably won't be I mean, it might be soon. It might not be soon. We'll see.
It won't be right after this episode. That's for sure.
It's not going to be like part 1, part 2, part 3. Like, it's not a chronological order. But I guess it is chronological. It's just like a random, like, chronological. I don't know the words.
That's our opinions. That's what the studies that we found were saying, and the information. That's all our confusion. And I think as far as the bit versus bitless debates, that was a very realistic one in presenting how I think most of us feel, is that we're not wanting to polarize one side or the other. We're just out here trying to figure out what is best for the welfare and health of our horses, that we can all continue on happy-go-lucky. Anyways, thank you guys so much for sticking with us through this episode. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, you can send us an email at mudstudsskullcaps@gmail.com, or you guys can reach out to us on Instagram at mudstuds_skullcaps.
And feel free to go to the Apple Podcast app and leave, what's your favorite bit or bitless option? What do you write in? You can leave that in your review. That's what your review could be. It could just be what your favorite horse headpiece option is.
Stay safe, stay classy, and stay in the saddle. Bye.